Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Welcome to today's video. Today's video is going to be talking about 5 palettes that I wish I bought. I missed out on these. They are now long discontinued, but I think about them often, and if they were released today, I would purchase them without a second thought. I really just have some huge FOMO when it comes to these palettes. So we're gonna talk about them. If that sounds good, make sure you give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I would love it if you stuck around. But with all that, let's just get into talking about some big regrets. All right, now, of course, my just obligatory disclaimer, I am traveling. You're gonna see my background change a lot. I was actually able to film quite a few videos in this space here because this Airbnb, for whatever reason, has like a nice office space with really great natural light, and I'm taking advantage of that to the fullest. But I hope you can stick through it with me while I'm just traveling until I kind of have like my more stable office background again. But now let's get into these palettes. I only have 5 because I really try, kind of like out of sight, out of mind. Like there's some palettes, I do regret not purchasing, but I can't think of them. And if I can't think of them, they didn't make this list because I really, that tells me how much I actually wanted the palette. Now, some of these are like years and years old. I really, there's one in particular that I just wish I had purchased, just at the time I didn't have the money. I'm gonna save that one for last and talk about the one that's the most recently discontinued, and that is the Sydney Grace California Coast. I'm gonna pop up some photos of all the palettes that I'm talking about. Obviously, I don't have them to show you, but the Sydney Grace California Coast, they recently discontinued this. They announced that they were discontinuing it a couple months ago, and at the time I was on a low buy and I was really trying to be strict with it. I was only allowing myself 1 palette purchase per month, and I had already purchased my palette for the month. So I told myself, okay, well maybe they have a lot of stock. If they still have it next month, I'll purchase it. And then of course they didn't. And I really regret kind of not bending my rules a little bit for that palette, because it was a palette that I had had my eye on for quite some time. I just usually, when it comes to Sydney Grace, I'm only buying during their Christmas and July sale, which recently passed, obviously in July. It was towards the end of July, but I actually did not purchase anything from them. I'm very proud. There hasn't been too much coming out from Sydney Grace that I've super fallen in love with. They're still a great brand, great quality, but I have way too many singles to be purchasing singles from them. And their palettes are a little bit like more warm toned. This palette in particular was a little bit more cool toned, and they were kind of ahead of their time. It was one of the more cool tone palettes that came out before we got the big rush of just cool tone palettes. And it's one that I really wish I had just picked up. For sure. If they like re-release it or have like stock, or I see it somewhere like unused, I would probably consider picking that up, just because I know the formula is great. And yeah, I should have, this is one where like I should have known better. I should have really broken my rules, but I didn't. Now the next one I want to talk about, this is one where at first when it launched, I wasn't interested in it. I didn't know a lot about the brand. This was actually my first time hearing about this brand. So this is the Odens Hela palette. Hela, I think it's Hela. And this was the collab, the first collab with Odens and Angelica Nyquist. I was not subscribed or really watching her content as much back when that palette launched. And that was my first time hearing of Odens, but they weren't really a brand that I was interested in buying until the Christmas palettes came out, because I think that palette launched earlier in the year, and then the Merry Christmas and the Christmas Eve palette launched at holiday, and that's when I kind of was really interested in trying that brand. This palette in particular, when I first saw it, that green turned me off. And I wasn't really looking at palettes as objectively back then. Back then, like eyeshadow, I wasn't as into. I'm definitely like finding my stride and finding what works for my eye shape more. I've always just really not liked my eyes, if I'm being honest. I don't have like those open, a lot of lid space showing eyes, and it's been very difficult for me to just play around and experiment and do different techniques, because the techniques you see on the internet are for people with different eye shapes than me. Typically, I never really like specifically searched for eyeshadow tutorials for my eye shape, so I always just thought I was bad at eyeshadow, and it's just that I wasn't using the right techniques for me. Anyways, that was like a tangent, but because of that, I kind of like wrote off a lot of eyeshadow palettes, and that's one where I think like if I was in the position that I'm in now with eyeshadow and that palette released, and I never seen it before, I would have wanted it. I could like look at that palette objectively and see that it's not just like a very colorful palette, but it does have some neutrals. It still has like tones I can work with pops of color. And I think it was a really well done palette that kind of gave a lot to a wide audience. So that is definitely a palette that I wish I would have purchased. And I think about that palette quite often. And then in the same vein, I'm just gonna knock two of these out at the same time, is the Odens Red Dragon palette. When that palette came out, I believe that was before the Hela palette, so I didn't know who Odens was. I hadn't heard of that brand yet, and I didn't follow the content creator. I think there was three palettes, so it was the Legendary Diversa collection with 3 creators, and I didn't know any of those creators. So this is a launch that kind of just went way under the radar for me. I didn't even know of this launch until it was discontinued, and that's why I ended up picking up all 3 of the Legendary Diversa palette collection 2, round 2, because of this palette. Because of the Red Dragon palette, I love the color story of this palette, which is surprising to me because I am not someone who loves warm tone palettes, but there's something about this one that really just draws me in. It seems to just be like a really easy to use palette where the shades are just like laid out for you, and it's very versatile. I mostly have just seen people talk about this palette. Sophie Alexandra, actually, on her channel, she talks about this palette quite often. That's where I see it the most. And the minute I saw it, I was like, man, I wish I knew that this palette released, because I would have picked it up, no questions asked. I just think it's like a really beautiful palette. And I feel like this was when Odens was really turning out like their top quality. Their quality's definitely just kind of been more up and down as of recent, and that was when they were like at the peak of just really coming out with like good palettes. So those are my 2 Odens palettes. I did have 2, but there are 2 palettes left. I'm still gonna save my number 1 for last. It's just at the very top of my list, because when I was making my list, it just was immediately the first one. But the second to last one I have to talk about is the Nars Climax palette. So this was I think holiday release, if I'm not mistaken. It was a 9-pan. I mean, again, I'll throw up the photo. I did really want that palette. At the time though, I think like there were so many holiday launches. You really have to like pick and choose when a holiday is coming out, like what do I want to get over what do I not want to get? Like I can't just be spending thousands of dollars in makeup. So it was kind of one like I really wanted, but it just didn't make the cut. And I highly regret that. I should have prioritized it more, because I know that Nars discontinues their products. Like their products actually are limited edition, and they don't re-release them. So I should have prioritized it more, but I didn't. And it's one that like I've just never been able to get off of my brain. I've actually looked for that palette on like third-party resellers like Mercier, Poshmark, etc. I feel like because it's Nars and because it's discontinued, people are asking like exorbitant prices for it. So I haven't been able to, and I won't bring myself to overspend on a palette just because I want it that bad. Like I have enough eyeshadow palettes to get by with it, but I will say it is one that when making this list, it instantly, like it just popped in my head. Like I wish I had bought that palette. I think what brought it down on the priority for me is, again, like different place with the eyeshadow, just mindset. It was a lot darker of a palette, But with Nars, like they tend to have a more sheer buildable formula, so I shouldn't have let that scare me as much as it did. But you know, it is what it is, and we're moving forward. It's just one that got away. The number one palette though that got away from me, and the one that I definitely regret the most not picking up, is the Tarte and Aspyn Ovard collection palette. I remember when this palette came out, it came out a long time ago. I mean, I want to say it was like 2014, 2015. I'll look it up to be like exact and put it up on the screen here. That palette came out and I instantly fell in love with it. I mean, it is a basic girl's dream of a palette. I wanted it so bad. I really purchased a lot from Tarte at the time, but I just didn't have as much expendable income back then. Like, I mean, I was working minimum wage jobs, multiple jobs, trying to pay my rent. I mean, I was really like on my own from the age of 18. So like I struggled a lot and I just didn't have the expendable money to be purchasing palettes like that all the time, but I really did want it. And they said it was limited edition, but I kind of thought I had more time. I was saving up for that palette and then it just got discontinued before I had the chance to even get it. So that's when it barely slipped out of my fingers. I was saving up for it, but I wasn't fast enough. And it's one that I don't know, I just really love. On top of that, I remember I watched Mel Thompson a lot back then, and she also loved that palette. Like that was her number one like staple basic palette. If she ever needed a complimentary palette to go with something, she was always pulling that palette, and it was already discontinued and she had like 3 backups or something like that. So it was every time I would watch her and see her pull this palette out and talk about how great it was, but it was already discontinued. It was just like another stab in the heart. So that is one where if Tarte re-released that palette, I know it was a collab palette. I don't know who Aspyn Ovard is even still to this day, but if they re-release that palette, I would purchase it in a second. Like, I can't even tell you how fast I would purchase that palette because I really, really wanted it and I was this close. I was this close to getting it. Again, you know, I had to pay my rent. So it slipped out of my fingers. It is what it is. Anyway, so those are the 5 palettes that I missed out on that are now discontinued. I'd love to hear the palettes, if there are any, that you wish you had purchased that maybe are no longer around. And do you still think, because there were a lot of palettes that I had on my list that when I was like realistic with myself, I was like, if that came out again, like, would it be at the top of my priority? Like, maybe not. I would still want it, but I maybe wouldn't prioritize it if there was another palette I loved more. This is really, like I said, the top of the palettes that I would repurchase. So I'd love to hear your list of palettes that are discontinued, but this is where I'm gonna leave you all. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're having a good day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.